welcome to all of you. So it's my pleasure to moderate this first plenary session, which we're calling the Healthy, Sustainable Mediterranean Diet at the Leading Edge of Science, Translating for Modern Appetites and Lifestyles. And we're very, it's a great honor to have 5 of the world's leading researchers on the Mediterranean diet with us all at the same time, all on the same stage. So you're really in for a great treat here this morning. So I want to just start, before we do a deep dive into the science, I want to kind of, go to the end in mind and talk a little bit about translation. Or simply, we might say, what's for dinner? This is our campus, the Culinary Institute of America. We're sort of the what's for dinner people, right? And so we're going to connect this all the way from the science to the translation and many other areas throughout this conference. For more than 20 years, we've collaborated very closely with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Department of Nutrition, and done a number of, I think, very impactful initiatives together. One of them is called Menus of Change, and the tagline is the business of healthy, sustainable, delicious food choices, right? It's got to be delicious. And for those of us that are, involved with business and organizations, if it doesn't make sense from a business perspective, it won't work. We've developed 24 principles of healthy, sustainable menu development. This is for chefs and restaurants that want to do an audit of what they're doing, looking at their different practices, both in terms of operations and ingredients to feature more of or feature less of. And so that's a lot to take in, and so we have sort of created a shorthand for how to think about all of those elements of health and sustainability, which we call plant-forward or plant-rich. And that's simply a style of cooking and eating that celebrates but is not limited to plant-sourced foods and that reflects the evidence-based principles of health and sustainability. My colleague Walter Willett always reminds me that chips and soda are also plant-based, and so we have to somewhat specify what we're talking about. And plant-rich is exactly where the 2025 Eat Lancet Commission on Healthy, Sustainable, and Just Food Systems landed in the report that they released at the Stockholm Food Forum last weekend, really looking at global dietary guidance in the run-up to 2050, when we'll have 10 billion people on the planet. We'll be talking more about the Eat Lancet report a little bit in this session, and then we have a whole session dedicated to that a little bit later on. So if you think about, sort of that framing of what is optimally healthy, what is sustainable, staying within planetary boundaries, you could imagine that this would be something we have to invent. That the world hasn't seen it. We have to invent this, right? But in fact, as President Bakker was saying, we can look to our cultural heritage. We can look for existing models for healthy, sustainable, plant-forward dietary patterns. And if you're thinking, where might that be, the branch of olives gives us a good clue here. That's why we, several years ago, created the Torre Barra Mediterranean Center with our colleagues at the University of Barcelona to have a footprint in the Mediterranean, to have a place where we can bring our students and we can conduct conferences and we can really do a deep dive. A friend of mine who's an author in the United States, cookbook author, Paula Wolfert, described the Mediterranean food and culture as like an onion. And you think you know something, you peel one layer and there's another layer below it. And then you peel another layer and there's another layer below it. And there's so much food heritage here that it takes a lifetime to learn it all. So to support the launch of the Eat Lancet report, we created something that we call Our Cultures, Our Meals, Cooking for Planetary Health, which is a photo documentary that we've created in 2 countries, in Greece and also in Vietnam, which I'll talk about in a minute. And this was a joint project of EAT, the EAT Foundation in Norway, the Culinary Institute of America, and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Aglaia Kremezi, who's a cookbook author and Greek food expert, was our culinary director for this report. And unfortunately, she was not able to join us for this conference. But I really encourage you to spend some time looking at this. I'll tell you where this is posted online a little bit later. But it was all photographed here in Messenia. And so for those of you that live in the area, you'll recognize some of these scenes. This is the plant-rich Greek kitchen, all the various ingredients that make up this wonderful cuisine. And we wanted to demonstrate what healthy meal patterns look like, right? It's not enough to talk about individual dishes. So what does a meal pattern look like? So this might be something with some fabulous chickpeas, some small fried fish, some eggplant, some pita, some fruit, and a little bit of yogurt. And we documented several of these meal patterns, which you can see. This was one that was photographed up in the mountains here. Some of you, I'm sure, have eaten at this restaurant. Just delicious vegetable preparations coming out of a wood-fired oven. Horta in many different forms. And then a local bakery that's participating with long fermentation, whole grain bread, absolutely delicious. And as I said, we also did a similar photo documentary project on Vietnam, which you can see on the site. So you can view both of these, the 2025 Eat Lancet Commission report and also our Culture, Our Meals for Planetary Health at the eatforum.org website /Eat Lancet, or also at the menusofchange.org website. And then just before we pivot to science, I also want to mention, I think Frank Hu is going to mention this as well, another really great resource for you is, this was published in May, 3 Decades of the Mediterranean Diet Pyramid, a narrative review of history, evolution, and advancement, published in the American Journal of Nutrition. All of the co-authors of this article are here on stage. So that's a very good resource for you as well. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Willett, who's going to address you first. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone who made it possible for us to come together in this wonderful setting today, this week. I'm going to give a brief overview, and I think my slides should be moving forward. Great, okay, thank you. This session is, again, Healthy, Sustainable Mediterranean Diet at the Leading Edge of Science, Translating for Modern Appetites and Lifestyles. I'm going to focus in my brief presentation what might be called a modern scientific era of investigation of the Mediterranean diet. I've been fortunate to actually have seen the Mediterranean diet food system before the huge changes that occurred. I took this picture in the early 1970s. This is Santorini before it became overrun by tourists. And at that time, people were living pretty much like they had been for a few thousand years. And Professor Trikopoulou will talk about not just this last half century, but 8,000 years before today. But at this time, our statistics were showing that men in Greece were living 4 years longer than Americans were, even though they had a simple lifestyle and a simple health system. And that did make us think that there was something to learn that we didn't know that was really important. Next slide, please. Guess I'm not advancing here. Okay, thank you. As we heard last night, the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle is, maybe the batteries or something, needs some life there, needs some olive oil, that fixes everything. The Mediterranean diet and lifestyle is about place, it's about food, but it's also about people. And I did want to briefly mention so much I've learned has come from my Greek colleagues, Professor Dimitri Trikopoulos, who was chair of our Department of Epidemiology at Harvard and taught us so much, and also introduced me to Antonia Trikopoulos, his wife, who taught me a whole lot more about the Mediterranean diet. Next slide, please. One of the seminal studies that got us off our thinking about the Mediterranean diet was the influential 7-country study led by Dr. Ansel Keys and included his colleagues here and around the Mediterranean region. In this study, they investigated about 1,000 men in 14 different settings, populations in 7 different countries around the world, including Japan at the far left there. And then they tracked the incidence of heart disease and mortality from heart disease over a decade. And this is what they found. The highest rates were in Finland at that time, and low in Japan and in the Mediterranean. But people paid most attention to those really high rates in Finland. And their diets were high in saturated fat at that time. And so the interpretation was, let's lower all kinds of fat because that will reduce saturated fat. But people didn't really pay much attention to that point down in the lower right-hand corner there, which actually had the lowest rates of heart disease. And it happens that was in Crete. Next slide, please. At the same time, other scientists around the world were looking at cancers in relation to diet. And there was a very strong relation between the national intake of total fat in the diet and breast cancer incidence. And a similar picture was seen for other cancers, colon cancer, endometrial cancer. And this combination of evidence, next slide please, led to the concept of main nutritional guidance that we should get rid of all fat in the diet. So this is the American Dietary Guidelines Pyramid of about 1990. And right up at the top, it says fats, oils, and sweets used sparingly. That included olive oil. We were supposed to get all types of fat out of the diet. And in turn, what are you going to eat? It has to be large amounts of carbohydrate. So that was the base of the food guide pyramid, that all kinds of carbohydrate without paying much attention to the quality of the carbohydrate was the really global recommendation. This was US, but this was repeated throughout the world. But next slide, please. What we were looking at did not really fit with that recommendation. These are the 3 large studies our group at Harvard has established. I'm going to focus on them a little bit because you'll hear quite a bit during the next 2 days of studies coming out of these large cohort studies. The first was the Nurses' Health Study, and in 1980, the red triangles there indicated when we started to collect diet using standardized methods. And this is over 100,000 women being followed across the United States. And we're tracking both their diets over time, and we're tracking incidence of all major diseases and overall mortality as well. We added 52,000 men in 1986 and another 116,000 women in 1989. So these studies are really unique in their comprehensive assessment of diet and outcomes over decades now. Next slide, please. So this is what we found when we looked at breast cancer. It was just flat, and this includes other studies that replicated that really non-existence of a strong association between fat in the diet and breast cancer. So this really was very contrary to what the national and global guidelines were at that time. So we thought it would really be good to bring this, the awareness of this to the public and to other scientists. So next slide, please. So in 1993, we held the first international conference on the Mediterranean diet. And this is actually Dr. Keyes on the left there. He's now at that time in 1993, was in his early 90s, and this is one of our colleagues who founded our Department of Nutrition at Harvard, Dr. Hegstead. But what was unique about this conference was it wasn't just a bunch of scientists. We invited food writers, we invited chefs, we invited food producers, the food service industry, to look in a very broad way at the evidence that we had in hand about diet and health and how that might be represented by the Mediterranean diet. And I should mention that Greg Drescher was one of the people who made this happen. He was there at that time working for Old Ways Trust, and he brought along Antonio, Professor Trikopoulou at that time, and scientists from other countries around the world. So this was a unique gathering. It was not just strictly a scientific conference. And I must say, everyone learned a lot there. I had food there that I never experienced before. It's just unimaginable that some of these things could be so good that were coming from the Mediterranean kitchens. Next slide, please. Out of that conference, we developed a food guide pyramid that was maybe you might say a competitor of the official food guide pyramid, and it looked very different because it had at the base whole grains. We were careful about the types of carbohydrates, fruits, legumes, vegetables, and olive oil right there at the middle, holding everything together, and then more and smaller amounts meat and other animal source products there. So this was very different. It was initially condemned by the nutrition community, but we persisted, and you'll hear a lot more about this during the subsequent presentations. Next slide, please. Our work, our investigations and our cohort studies continued on into the future, and during the 1990s here, Frank Hu published this really seminal paper in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at different types of dietary fat and risk of heart disease. And the basic point being that not all fats are the same. And some of them there at the top, if you look at saturated fat moving to carbohydrate, it doesn't do much to heart disease risk. But if you replace healthy fats, unsaturated fats, mono and polyunsaturates with carbohydrate, heart disease risk actually goes up, which is the opposite of what the pyramid, the official pyramid, was saying. But if we replace saturated fat with unsaturated fats or trans fats with unsaturated fats, in all of those situations, replacing healthy fats for unhealthy fats, heart disease risk goes down in a big way. Next slide. So that was, again, somewhat controversial at the beginning, but it's really accepted throughout the nutrition community at this point in time. Another seminal paper came along, this one led by Professor Trikopoulou, looking at the whole Mediterranean dietary pattern and survival in a cohort that they had established in Greece. Next slide, please. This assessed the diets of individuals and then tracked them over time and scored each person's diet according to a really simple scoring method that beneficial foods got 1 point and detrimental foods got a negative point. There was a total score of 0 to 9. Next slide, please. And then when they looked at the relation between the score and mortality rates over the next coming years, they found important reductions in death from any cause, death from heart disease, death from cancer, with better score on this Mediterranean Dietary Pattern Index. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end there. You'll hear a lot more from Dr. Hu and Professor Trikopoulou and from our colleagues in Spain as well. But we have, sometimes we think we haven't done much, but actually we have transformed thinking about healthy diets from that time when all fat was evil and load up on carbohydrate. Dietary guidelines around almost every country in the world have shifted in a very important way, and the Mediterranean diet was the major driver, the example we could hold up to say that this, over thousands of years, has supported the healthiest populations in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Willett. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Antonia Trikopoulou, who is with the Academy of Athens. And if you don't know her or know of her, she is truly a national treasure of Greece, and it's a great honor to have you with us today.
Καλημέρα σε όλους σας. Είναι πολύ μεγάλη μου χαρά που βρίσκομαι στη Μεσσηνία με ένα τόσο εκλεκτό ακροατήριο και με όλους εσάς, φίλους και συνεργάτες στο δύσκολο δρόμο για την διεθνή αναγνώριση και κατοχήρωση της μεσογειακής διατροφής. Επειδή ο χρόνος είναι περιορισμένος, θα είμαι λίγο σύντομης σε αυτή την εισαγωγή στα ελληνικά, γιατί οι οργανωτές μου υπέδειξαν να προχωρήσω στην παρουσίαση του θέματος το οποίο πρόκειται να μιλήσω στην αγγλική. Και έτσι δεν θα μιλήσω σε αυτή την ιερή πραγματικά γλώσσα την ελληνική, αλλά θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. Ευχαριστώ πολύ. So, dear colleagues and friends, it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here and to address such a distinguished audience. And thank you for all of you for being here, and I thank the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to be here and to discuss you about Mediterranean diet. But before proceeding, επόμενη παρακαλώ. Okay, thank you. Before proceeding in the presentation of of analyzing my topic, I wish to tell you that the Mediterranean diet term has been more than often misused, either intentionally or unintentionally. Thus, there is a need to at least to tell you what in this presentation, when we are talking about Mediterranean diet, what we mean. We mean that Mediterranean diet is a dietary pattern found in the olive-grown areas of the Mediterranean region in the late 50s and early 60s. And some of you, I think nobody actually, but I have to tell you that, if you ask why in the olive-grown areas of the Mediterranean region, because Mediterranean diet without olive oil does not exist. We might speak about Mediterranean type diet, but not about Mediterranean diet. Olive oil is central to the Mediterranean diet. And why before the 50s and 60s? Because as you know, several of you, because some of us will have a certain age, after the 50s and 60s, dramatic changes happened socioeconomic all over the world. And the world changed a lot, and also the dietary habits. So, having said that, sorry, την επόμενη παρακαλώ. Having said that, I was asked by my friend and colleague, Dr. Drescher, Greg, to make a review of the evolution of the Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean diet is deeply rooted in history. And then even from the prehistoric, in the prehistoric period, we know that about 7,000 years before Christ, in the so-called prehistoric era, because our history is divided, as everywhere, or the history in the world, in prehistoric and historic. The historic start by the time we have written texts. If we have only information from excavation, it's prehistoric. So the excavation, they demonstrated that here in Greece, the agriculture, the dawn of agriculture started in the 7,000 before Christ. 7,000 before Christ. And slowly this was followed, next please, by the domestication of animals and plants. And at that time, the prehistoric era, they were eating olives, they were eating lentils, they were eating grains because that's what they start cultivating. And here, μήπως την προηγούμενη δείξετε. So, yes, the next one, okay. And the next one, please. Την επόμενη. I don't know what's happening. So here, for example, we have evidence from the excavation of what they were eating. And this go back to 3,000 years, to 1,600 years from the catastrophe which happened in Santorini and so on. But, next please. Την επόμενη παρακαλώ. So, and then after the year 1000 before Christ, we start having our alphabet and writing, and we have text. So we're talking about the historical period, what happened in this historical period, how Mediterranean diet evolved. Because they have a lot of trade, many new products they enter, and it was more diversified. In contrast, in the prehistoric period, the food was mainly for survival, but in the historical period, food was not only for survival, because it has several social and religious aspects. And this is a very, very important turning point. Next, please. Then the Romans, they came here, and the Romans, the Roman diet was richer and more varied because Roman was an empire, and then the spices, for example, they came here, oranges, lemons from Persia, and so on. And all these foods, they were adapted, and they became an integral part of the Mediterranean diet, as well as later on, all the foods which they were imported from America. But yet, in this Roman Greek period, the Greek food remains simpler and more philosophical in nature. Remember the symposium, which means that I am eating, I am drinking togetherness. Even Plato was saying that you cannot be a educated human being if you eat alone. You eat together, we share ideas. So it was closely related to social aspects, the food, as well as we see later on in the Byzantine era, when the Greek, they became mostly Greek Orthodox. And the Greek Orthodox religion, we have to fast half of the days of the year. Half of the days of the year, more than 150 days per year, we have to avoid food of animal origin, and every Wednesday and Friday. Next, please. So the America was discovered, and many foods they enter all over the world, including Greece, like tomatoes, potatoes, corn, beefs, peppers, but again, the Mediterranean, anything new is coming. No matter if it is food, if it is ideas, if it is the people, we absorb them. And they are becoming Greeks, our Greek way of life. And that's after all this, when all the introduction of all these foods, the Mediterranean character was kept. Next, please. Next, την επόμενη παρακαλώ. So, we're going to in 1837, because all these years, it was a common thread. It was, the basic was the Mediterranean triad: olives, grain, and wine. Wine is an integral part of the Mediterranean diet, but it's another story. Well, then in 1837, a British scholar, Partley, went to Crete, and he spent several months in Crete, and he wrote a book of 500 pages, in which is mentioned the evening meal was a dish of wild greens, In our national guidelines, which they are based on the Mediterranean diet pyramid developed in 1993, in the Greek version we see under the term of vegetables, don't forget the wild greens. So, Parsley wrote that the evening meal was a dish of wild greens, which seems to be their main diet. They boil them and add olive oil, and lemon, of course, but bread, olives, and sometimes cheese complement their meals. A mother will rarely give bread to her child without putting oil on a plate to soak in this liquid of life. I have never seen in the literature a better description for olive oil than these 3 words, liquid of life. Next, please. Επόμενη, παρακαλώ. Then the Rockefeller study, following the demand of our Πρωθυπουργός, president, asked the Rockefeller Foundation to come to Greece and to help us describe the problem which we have, because Greece in 1948 was a damaged country, followed because, as you may know, after the Second World War, we have a detrimental civil war. And Greece really was in a very difficult situation. So our Prime Minister asked the Rockefeller Foundation to come and to investigate of food practices and dietary patterns in Crete, and examine the feasibility of raising the standard of living in an underdeveloped area. I have to make a correction. Crete was not an underdeveloped area, it was an economically underdeveloped area, and we'll see why I'm saying that. Next slide, please. After saying several months in Greece, this Rockefeller Foundation, they did an excellent report for every aspect of life, but again, somewhere they mentioned the food consumption level were surprisingly good. On the whole, their food pattern and food habits were extremely well adapted to their natural and economic resources as well as their needs. That means that their dietary habits, they were both healthy and sustainable. It's very well described. And then you see these people, they are not underdeveloped. They are economically underdeveloped. These pictures are from this period by Nellis. Την επόμενη παρακαλώ. And then as Professor Willett, my very good friend, and my husband friends also, Walter, mentioned the 7 country studies. Here I have to stop for a moment, and I don't know, maybe I exceed the 10 minutes we gave me, Greg, to tell you that in these original 7 country studies, never Ansel Keys, he mentioned about the beneficial effects of olive oil. He was saying that it was neutral. But what he said clearly, he said that the Mediterranean diet is very good as a low saturated lipid diet. Why I'm mentioning that? Because at that time in Finland, they have a very high incidence of coronary disease. And because it's a very well-organized society and they take under consideration what the scientists, they say, they develop an intervention. And they say we have to reduce saturated fat. How? Don't eat butter. Don't eat meat. Don't eat lard. But then we need some lipids. What do we have available? Seed oils. Perfect solution. And then the whole Finnish population and other, subsequently other Northern European countries, they turn to seed oils. This didn't mean that we in Greece, we have to change our dietary habits, and replace olive oil with seed oils and margarines. Subsequently, it was a huge, I was then very young doctor, it was a huge intervention in Greece. Even the cardiologists, they were supporting the consumption of seed oils. We start cutting the trees, the olive trees. The same happened in Israel and in Cyprus and in Palestine. And then one day here, in the palace of Nestor, a peasant approached me and he said to me, I know you appear in television and you speak about nutrition. Tell me, I cannot eat this seed oil. I have my oil, my Kalamata oil, but they tell me that I have to throw away it and to cook in seed oils. This is impossible for me. Really, I was angry, and then it started my career and my interest for the Mediterranean diet and olive oil. Next, please. Then it was not so easy. And for the very first time I need to persuade everybody in Greece that we have to continue in olive oil, so I needed support. And then you see on the left, Grande Govian, the Spanish colleague, I'm sure that you know him. He was an eminent scientist from Spain, and he was a collaborator also of Ansel Keys in Minnesota. So when, I don't know how I found him, and he accepted to come. And then it's me, of course, 40, and I don't know how many years ago, 40 years, probably, ago. And then on the right is my husband, who at that time he was his, as Walter mentioned, he was his close contact with, at Harvard. And then he asked his mentor, Brian McMahon, which was holding, let's say, the position which Frank Holmes has now in Boston. And we did the very first meeting, olive oil and health. And then we did, next please. And then we needed support, and we tried to also to persuade the foreigners that it was impossible what WHO, World Health Organization, was saying, reduce fat intake to 25%. This was the catastrophe for the Mediterranean diet. And thanks to the work of the Harvard University, which they have proven that fat is not so important for obesity, as it's the type of fat which counts. But then, nothing of that existed. And then we have the very first conference, international conference on Mediterranean diet, and indicatively, the title of the conference was Why, When, and What. We were swimming in unknown waters. Well, next, please. And then it came in 91, finally. The international community started being interested. And you know who was the key factor for this symposium? It was Greg Drescher. And Greg, he came to my office in Athens. At that time, he was a very young, let's say, boy. And then we started a collaboration and friendship till today, and it was created this legendary symposium in 91 in Porto Caras. Next, please. Then you know the story. Then when we try to persuade the international colleagues that, you know, what you are doing, I mean, you have different, you do not take under account our tradition, that we are healthy, what we are eating. You do not know everything, nothing about Greece. And then you decide for us without knowing what we are. And this is a lesson. We have to be very careful. We have to have our own data. And we have to participate in the international committees and when decisions are taken. Nevertheless, I was asked data, you know, in the 80s, in the 90s, in Greece, to provide data for the international scientific evidence. It was very hard, but we succeeded. And it was the very first paper in 1995, and in which we demonstrated that adherence to Mediterranean diet, it was associated with lower mortality. Next, please. And then you have seen the pyramid and this great conference in '93 happened in Boston. Dr. Willett, Dr. Drescher, and many others, they were there, and we developed this pyramid. Next, please. Here is, in this international conference on the diets of the Mediterranean diet, and it's Ansel Keys was speaking, and you know, I'm watching him very carefully. Next, please. And then Greece was the very first country all over the world who adopted the Mediterranean diet as our national guidelines. The Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry, I think, also of Culture, they adopted, they printed, they distributed everywhere this pyramid, in which also you see that under vegetables is written clearly, don't forget the wild greens. Next, please. Then I want to tell you that in Europe, many colleagues, and from Spain, it was Luis Serra-Mayem, who was very, very active in the decade of the 2000 and in the 90s. And here you see a picture with Ansel Keys again in one of his several meetings he organized all over Europe, Serra-Mayem, and Denis Fidanza, which was one of the collaborators of Ansel Keys in the 7-country studies, and my colleague on the right, Anna Ferrolucci from Istituto Nazionale in Rome, della Nutrizione. Next, please. And then we, the European groups, we developed, not develop, in a way we adapted, we evolved the original 93 Mediterranean diet to this one, which was approved by many scientific institutions all around Europe. And I wish to show you something which you will taste today. In this, besides the wild greens, which is mentioned in the Greek version, in here we added also herbal infusions, not only water. It's something, there are elements, there are characteristics of Mediterranean diet which we, the scientists, we do not take under account. We do not take into account in epidemiological studies the role of wild greens, the fact that we consume a lot of herbal infusion. Next, please. But at the end, and this is the end of the story, the Mediterranean diet has been named the best overall diets for 2025 by the United States News and World Report. Not only because it's healthy, but because it's tasty. Because nutrition is not only calories and nutrients, it's an art, it's a culture, an expression of culture, it's an expression of togetherness, it's an expression of tradition, and it's a pleasure. Should be tasty. And Mediterranean diet has been approved as a tasty diet. Next, please. Oh. I have another one. I don't know, maybe this is the previous version, the one which I added. And then we say there is huge work which has been done in the Mediterranean diet. Then every year, I mean, if you open the PubMed, when you find the new publication, you will see an article on Mediterranean diet. Of course, on this, the group of Dr. Willett was pioneering and instrumental in proving the value of Mediterranean diet. But now there are not hundreds, thousands of, but still we do not know the mechanism. We know to proceed and give emphasis more on genetics and metabolomics. Thank you very much.
So there we just got several thousand years of the history of the Mediterranean diet in just a few minutes, but it's so important to understand that foundation and some of those major milestones. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Frank Ku, who is the chairman of the Department of Nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor for me to be here. I want to thank the organizers for organizing such a magnificent conference. And what I'm going to do in the next 10, 15 minutes is to talk about the mechanisms that Antonia just mentioned. So how many of you here believe that Mediterranean diet is good for you? Everyone, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't come here. How many of you know why Mediterranean diet is good for you? Some. So the modern nutrition sciences have been very powerful in terms of unlocking the secrets behind the traditional Mediterranean diet. So today I'm going to give you a quick overview about the work we have done in the last 20 to 30 years. Thanks to the pioneering work of Antonia, Walter, and others, nutrition epidemiology has shifted its focus from single nutrient and the single food analysis to dietary patterns like the Mediterranean diet. This was not the case 20 or 30 years ago. At that time, dietary pattern analysis was considered as a new direction in nutrition epidemiology. In our cohorts, we analyzed the association between adherence to Mediterranean diet and a wide range of health outcomes. What we found is that adherence to Mediterranean style diet in the US populations is beneficial for the prevention of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, some cancers, and premature deaths. And then in 2002, Mark McCallum, a doctoral student in our department who was working with Walter, developed this new diet quality index called Alternative Healthy Eating Index, or HEI. HEI has become one of the most extensive studied diet quality index and has also been widely used to evaluate compliance with dietary guidelines and also overall diet quality. And subsequently, many of our studies have looked at whether improvement in diet quality based on AHEI or other diet quality indices is beneficial for the prevention of chronic disease and premature deaths. In our cohorts, we found that a variety of diet quality indices, including HEI, Alternative Mediterranean Diet Index, Healthy Plant-Based Diet Index, they're all associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease and mortality, underscoring that there is no one-size-fits-all diet. Healthy dietary patterns like Mediterranean diet can be adapted to different cultures and different backgrounds and different populations. Even though olive oil consumption in the US is much lower than the Mediterranean countries, because of very large sample size and long duration follow-up of our cohorts, we were able to evaluate the associations between olive oil consumption and a variety of health outcomes. And we found that higher consumption of olive oil, according to American standards, not the Mediterranean standard. Here we're talking about only 3 to 4 tablespoons of olive oil per week, not per day. It was beneficial for the prevention of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, premature deaths, and even dementia. And another important finding is that increasing consumption of olive oil, even though it's very high in calories, high in fat, it's not associated with increased obesity risk. In fact, increase in consumption of olive oil is associated with lower obesity risk in our cohorts. Because of the advances in omics technologies and big data analytics and AI, nutrition research has shifted from traditional black box epidemiology to a systems epidemiology. So using modern technologies like genomics and metabolomics, we can gain deeper understanding of the biological mechanisms, such as your gut microbiome, your genetics, and also your metabolomics. In the past 15 to 20 years, we have been working very closely with our colleagues in Spain, especially Dr. Miguel Angel Gonzalez. We have obtained several NIH grants to incorporate metabolomics and precision nutrition into the PREDIMED trial. This is a review paper we published recently summarizing recent advances in precision nutrition and the cardiometabolic diseases. Using the modern technologies, we have been able to identify novel small molecules, molecule metabolites in the blood and the urine samples that predict future risk of cardiovascular disease. And we found Mediterranean dietary interventions significantly improved those metabolites, and also Mediterranean diet can mitigate the harmful effects of those metabolites that you can measure in blood samples or urine samples. Using the metabolomics data, we were able to develop metabolic signatures of adherence to the traditional Mediterranean diet, first in the PREDIMED trial, and then replicated the signature in the Harvard cohort. And then we analyzed both the metabolomics data and also genetics data. We provided further evidence that adherence to Mediterranean diet is beneficial for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. So this is, I think, a very good example of how we can integrate modern technologies like genomics, metabolomics into large epidemiological studies and also clinical trials to improve our understanding of the mechanisms underlying the beneficial effects of Mediterranean diet on cardiovascular disease. We know that Mediterranean diet is very rich in polyphenols. Most of the polyphenols are not absorbed in small intestine, but instead are metabolized by gut bacteria, and those bacteria actually can produce bioactive compounds called small molecule metabolites. So you can actually measure those polyphenol metabolites in either blood samples or urine samples. So in this study, we measured several dozens of urinary polyphenol metabolites in Rosa Namula's lab at the University of Barcelona. And we identified several novel polyphenol metabolites that predict lower risk of cardiovascular disease in the PREDIMED trial. So most of those gut bacteria-derived metabolites actually come from traditional Mediterranean foods. They are rich in polyphenols such as extra virgin olive oil and fruits and vegetables, nuts, and also red wine. So this study, I think, provides very strong evidence that polyphenol-rich foods, which are very high in traditional Mediterranean diet, are beneficial for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. And now there is increasing evidence that adherence to Mediterranean diet can also improve our gut microbiome. So there are trillions of bacteria in our gut. They play a very important role in our immune function, in insulin resistance, in energy metabolism, and so on and so forth. So in this study, we found that plant-rich food in the Mediterranean diet can promote healthy bacteria in our gut. And also eating a variety of plant-based foods can increase the diversity of gut microbiome. And we also found that our gut microbiome, or the bacteria in our gut, can influence how we respond to dietary interventions. So in this study, we found that certain gut bacteria species can improve our response to Mediterranean diet. So it means that there is an interaction or interplay between our diet and our gut microbiome. So we are what we eat, but we are also are what our bacteria eat. So you really have to treat your gut bacteria very well by feeding them healthy foods. And we know that genetics play a very important role in the development of chronic diseases, including dementia. But there is also increasing evidence that our diet can influence your genetic susceptibility to certain diseases. And in this analysis, we found adherence to Mediterranean diet overall reduce the risk of dementia, improve cognitive function, but people who benefit most from the Mediterranean diet are those who carry two ApoE genetic variants. So people who carry those genetic variants at a very high risk of developing dementia, they're 10 times more likely to develop dementia compared to lung carriers. What we found is that those high-risk individuals benefit even more from adherence to Mediterranean diet. So this means that, again, genetics is important, but genetics is not our destiny. We can eat a healthy diet and to be more physically active to reduce or mitigate potential adverse effects of our genes on our health outcomes. Some of you may have heard that this claim that all seed oils are toxic, we should go back to beef tallow or butter. But this is not supported by scientific evidence. And in our cohorts, consuming all plant-based oils is not associated with increased risk of mortality. In fact, consuming olive oil, of course, is the most beneficial in terms of reducing mortality. Even some of the so-called seed oils, like soybean oil or canola oil, actually are associated with lower risk of mortality. And there is no evidence that any of these so-called seed oils is bad for health. On the other hand, higher consumption of butter is associated with mortality. And if you replace butter with those oils, especially olive oil, is beneficial for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. And this was confirmed in the recent analysis by incorporating lipidomics into our large cohort studies. So we found that replacement of saturated fat with unsaturated fat is associated with beneficial effects on your lipidomics, small molecule metabolites, small RCT, and these changes in lipidomics can actually predict lower risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease in large cohort studies. So this is a complex study design. First, we derive a lipidomics score based on a small clinical trial where saturated fat was replaced with unsaturated fat. And then we applied this score to several large cohort studies, including the EPIC Potsdam cohort, the health study, and the PREDIMED. We found that this score, which reflects the beneficial effects of replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat, actually predict low risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease 10 or 20 years down the road. So this example, I think, provide very strong evidence that replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat is beneficial for the prevention of cardiometabolic diseases. This is a paper that Greg just mentioned earlier, and this was published in AJCN several months ago, and it's actually free to everyone who wants to download it. So this paper was based on our presentations at the International Olive Oil Council conference last year in Madrid. And I think this is really useful resources for those who are interested in history, evolution, and the scientific advances in the Mediterranean diet. So thank you very much.
And now we're going to go to our next speaker, Miguel Angel Martinez Gonzalez, who's joining us from the University of Navarra and is also an adjunct professor at Harvard.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for me. Sorry, my voice is not in its best shape, but I'll try to do my best for this presentation. It is a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here today. I want to thank the organizers of this interesting conference. I'm so excited for all the meeting with my friends and colleagues. We have been working for a long time. So I will focus just in two aspects of the Mediterranean diet, olive oil and wine. So because Ramon Struck, we have agreed that he will deal with the overall picture of the Mediterranean diet in our studies. So olive oil, do we have randomized controlled trial evidence supporting the role of olive oil? This is the main question, because we cannot go beyond an RCT, a randomized controlled trial. So in randomization, as Rory Collins established here, we overcome potential biases inherent in observational studies. So perhaps when the effects are not very strong, when we have a control group and we assign at random participants, we get rid of many potential problems because in medicine, randomized controlled trials of adequate size are generally required to ensure that we have reached the top of scientific evidence, especially when the effects are not very strong and large observational studies may yield misleading associations. So we need to do something like this. And this is what we done in Predimed, to do a randomized trial. So I will not stop here, but you know, we were we were shipping olive oil for free, like 1 liter a week to 2,500 participants every week. This is meaning 2.5 tons per week during several years. So thanks to the Patrimonio Comunal Olivarero, who provided for free the olive oil. And after 5 years, we were able to assess the risk of hard clinical events. This is unique. And what we found, I'm pretty sure that you know very well this slide, was a strong reduction, clinically very meaningful, in the risk of major cardiovascular disease in the group allocated at random to olive oil. So, but perhaps you don't know so well this study by Miguel Ruiz Canela in JAMA. So when we assess the risk of peripheral artery disease, the relative risk reduction was very impressive with olive oil, 68%. Also with nuts, because in another group we provided nuts, the comparator was always the low-fat diet that we were recommending. And also for atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is an arrhythmia that will develop in 1 out of every 4 persons after 40 years. and only with olive oil we were able to see a reduction in the risk of new cases of arrhythmia of atrial fibrillation. We have conducted another trial, PREDIMAR, and we are very close now to publish the results with patients already with arrhythmia at baseline. And already Frank mentioned this paper by Marta Wash in 2 large cohorts. So the PREDIMED is the nurses' health study and the health professional follow-up study are the largest studies looking at observational studies looking at olive oil. So Marta Wash here was able to assess the effect of the olive oil in cardiovascular disease. So PREDIMED is not in isolation. It is also supported by the largest observational study showing that olive oil was associated with a 14% lower risk of cardiovascular disease and an 18% lower risk of coronary heart disease. And also in isocaloric substitution models, olive oil was better than other fats or other culinary fats. And the same can be said about total mortality, with relative reductions on 90% for all-cause and cardiovascular death, 17% lower risk of cancer mortality, 29% lower risk of neurodegenerative mortality, and 18% lower risk of respiratory mortality. We conducted a meta-analysis recently of olive oil consumption and outcome-wide meta-analysis looking at total mortality, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer. And we found a protective association against cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and all-cause mortality. After assessing 27 studies, and this was for every 25 grams a day of olive oil, we found a 16% reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, 22% lower risk of diabetes, and 11% reduction in all-cause death. Fortunately, almost at the same time that we published this meta-analysis, there was another meta-analysis looking at 2 of these outcomes, cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality, and the results were fairly consistent with only small differences. So they were comparing in this meta-analysis the lower, the higher versus the lower consumption. So this is for olive oil. What about wine? So, you know, more than 100 observational studies. Wine is highly controversial now, especially. So more than 100 conventional epidemiologic studies have found this. So this is a J-shaped risk pattern in association with the consumption of alcohol, abstention, higher risk than moderation, and the highest risk for heavy consumption of any alcoholic beverage. So Antonia, my good friend Antonia Tricopolo, did this splendid study of the anatomy of the health effects of the Mediterranean diet. When you remove, what happens if you remove wine in the definition of the Mediterranean diet, you lose a lot of the beneficial effect of the Mediterranean diet. 23.5% of the protection is lost if you remove moderate ethanol consumption from the definition of the Mediterranean diet. We found with Inés Domínguez, who was a postdoc working with Rosa Lamuela, she also came to Harvard, and with Ramon Struck also, we found using an objective biomarker of wine consumption, all kinds of wine, not only red wine, we found a 50% relative reduction in the risk of major cardiovascular disease. In this case cohort study published this year in the European Heart Journal, you see for a consumption of around 12 to 35 glasses of wine per month that was measure just by the urinary biomarker, we were able to find a 50% relative reduction in the risk of major cardiovascular disease. So this is not related to self-reported consumption, but to objectively measure in biomarker. But very recently, last May, this vignette in the New England Journal of Medicine said that new evidence suggested that any alcohol use can adversely affect health. So they were quoting their reference number 9 was this global burden of disease study published in Lancet 2018, and this was 7 years later. This was the paper published in Lancet, and the comment that no level of alcohol consumption improves health, that was an added commentary in Lancet. So the healthiest level is 0 for everyone, but they forgot that 4 years later, the same group in the same journal published that small amounts of alcohol consumption are associated with improved health outcomes in population that predominantly face a high burden of CVD. So you need to give a very nuanced message, very specific for age ranges, and also taking into account the drinking pattern. So even within the same group, there is a controversy. So they received, the authors of the vignette received a letter quoting that there was more recent evidence in 2020. So who were the authors of the letter? You can suspect we were the authors of the letter, telling them also that the drinking pattern, so drinking wine, drinking with meals, spreading the consumption all throughout the week was perhaps more important than the absolute amount of ethanol. So even in the United States, at the beginning of this year, 2 reports were apparently contradictory. The Surgeon General Advisory Board said no alcohol at all in order to prevent cancer, whereas the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine said that drinking in moderation, that is 2 drinks or fewer in a day for men and 1 for women, have moderate evidence that it lowers all-cause mortality. So again, we have a strong controversy here, but both of them were in agreement that we needed further studies, more research is needed, especially there are no published clinical trials. So also the American Heart Association in this statement said randomized controlled trials are needed in order to solve this controversy. So this is a scandal, you know. These are the largest clinical trials on alcohol, on health effects. They are very well conducted, but they are very small in size and only looking at intermediate markers of disease. So we were fortunate to receive this grant from the European Research Council at the end of 2023. That is called UNATI, University of Navarra Alumni Trialist Initiative. There is a non-inferiority randomized trial testing advice, 2 different advices, one for moderate drinking and another for abstention in current drinkers. Current drinkers from 50 to 75 years old, and everything is done online, remotely. So we are comparing like 2 options. One is to recommend abstention, and the other is to recommend drinking not more than 1 drink per day for women and not more than 2 for men, always with meals, preferring red wine spread all over the week and avoiding binge drinking. So, and the outcome, the trial will last 4 years, and the outcome is a composite of all these diseases associated with alcohol consumption. So we started this, well, the PowerPoint is spoiled, this slide. So we started the recruitment at the middle of 24, and this is the current status of our recruitment. We aim to reach 10,000 people, and the future will say what we find. We are completely agnostic regarding the outcome, but we are doing our best to conduct this trial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. And now our final speaker is joining us from Barcelona. Professor Ramon Estruch is Professor of Medicine at the University of Barcelona. He's also the chair of our Scientific Advisory Council for the Tora Bora Mediterranean. Professor Estruch.
Thank you, Greg, for the introduction, and thank you for the audience to be here listening and learning on Mediterranean diet as the healthiest diet. My talk is the last, so I have to complement the information given by especially by Miguel Angel and Franju. So we want to look for the best diet we can recommend to our colleagues, to our patients, to the society. So I want to analyze what could be the pillars of a healthy diet, and the conclusion that the Mediterranean diet is the best. So this is a very important study performed in Harvard, looking for the main lifestyle factors that determine the longevity, so the mortality. And this is do not smoke, to maintain an adequate body mass index, to practice exercise, to drink a moderate amount of alcohol, mainly wine, and also to follow a healthy diet. The problem is what could be the healthiest diet we can recommend to our colleagues, and what could be the basis of this diet. But diet has to be included in a lifestyle, so we look for could be the best lifestyle, but we believe that diet is the best component of the lifestyle. So we have to look for a balanced, nutrient-rich diet, to practice exercise regularly, to maintain and maintain an emotional well-being. This is important to adequate the quality of sleep, to weight management, to avoid harmful substance, to preventive health care, and also it's important sustainability and life purpose in this basis. But as I told you, we believe that diet is really the key of all the lifestyle. And in this sense, there are several studies, this is one of these, that try to could be the main factors, the burden of disease. In this study was hypertension, but dietary habits is in the second position in this. In other studies was the best. So we have to look for the best dietary habits in order to reduce the burden or kind of burden of disease. This is the American Heart Association recommendations, and also diet is one of the main life essential 8 components for a healthy life. But the problem of diet, I told you, is so many diets, so many foods, so many nutrients that sometimes it's difficult to look for the best that we can use. In this sense, we know that the main components of the healthy diet could be fruit, vegetables, whole grains, proteins, healthy fats, including olive oil, dairies, and alternative. Also, we believe that little amounts of alcohol, especially in wine, is also important components of a healthy diet. And also, we have to limit some components like added sugars, refined grains, etc. But when we look for this, how you combine these components, you look for a dietary pattern. We believe that the dietary pattern has a more effect than only to have olive oil in your meals or to drink wine for us. So dietary pattern has a mix of the synergistic effects, all of these in these kinds. So when you look for the characteristics of an ideal diet, we'll have look for nutrition adequacy, has to be effective in prevention, has to be sustained by high-quality scientific evidence, has to be easy to follow, this is important, has to be affordable, sustainable, and without major commercial interest. In this sense, it's a lot of healthy dietary patterns that we could find: Mediterranean diet, Nordic diet, Dutch diet, Maine diet, flexitarian diet, Okinawa diet, vegetarian diet. So we have a lot of to choose, but we leave what to do. But you can see here that Mediterranean diet has ranked the first in several rankings, like this of the US News rankings, that Mediterranean is better than Dutch diet and Maine diet. And this is the pyramid, has been already explained, but we have to look for a very well-designed studies to be sure that our recommendations are the truth, and we have to look for randomized clinical trials. One was that performed by the group of Cordoba in Spain, analyzing the effects of a Mediterranean diet, plenty of olive oil, in patients that has had a myocardial infarction, and they found after 7 years of follow-up that the Mediterranean diet, plenty of olive oil, compared to a low-fat diet, decreased in 28% in overall cohort, and 30% the risk of reinfarction or death in these groups. This is a huge effect of protection against cardiovascular disease. In the PREDIMED has been shown that has been explained very well by Miguel Angel. We saw that in the group of Mediterranean diet, and this was a randomized clinical trial, was a 31% reduction of a composite of cardiovascular outcomes like myocardial infarction, stroke, and cardiovascular death, which had demonstrated with the highest level of scientific evidence that Mediterranean diet, plenty of olive oil and nuts, protects effectively against cardiovascular disease. When you look for a stroke, the results were even bigger, and you can see that in the group of Mediterranean plus nuts was a 50% reduction in the risk of stroke. This is a very big protection against this disease. And we have tried also comparing different types of diets. We are planning to publish it nearly, that Mediterranean diet was also the best to protect against stroke, better than Dutch diet, and also than the Maine diet. So, also in stroke, I think that Mediterranean diet is really the best choice you can recommend. Or Dutch diet is also good because reduce hypertension and reduce hemorrhagic stroke. But when you look for a stroke, as overall, Mediterranean diet was better. But we want to know what's happened with mortality. Mortality is the most important variable we can measure in the studies, and we saw in the PREDIMED that was after only 5 years was near 20% reduction of mortality in the group of olive oil. But when you join the both groups of Mediterranean diet plus virgin olive oil and nuts, and we look for protocols, so the people who truly follow the Mediterranean diet versus the people who truly follow the low-fat diet, we found near a 60% reduction of cardiovascular outcomes. This is a terrible number of protection, more than any drug that you can use in these patients. But we are looking for longevity, but we're also very interested in quality of life. In quality of life depend absolutely of your brain function, and we measure from psychological test and functional brain test the brain function, and we saw that in the group of the hospital clinic that was really a protection against frontal cognition. Frontal cognition is the most important brain function for humans. And you can see that the group of Uruguay was a reversion of this of this disease compared to low-fat diet that was a regression of this function. This could be an anti-aging effect of the group of olive oil, especially in brain function. So we want to maintain your brain functioning quite well. You have to follow Mediterranean diet, plenty of olive oil. We have looked also what happened with cancer, and we saw that was also a very high protection against brain cancer in the group of Mediterranean diet plus olive oil. And when we look for another studies, like the SUN studies performed by Miguel Ángel Martínez in Navarra, and we can see that the people who follow the Mediterranean diet, who truly follow Mediterranean, was a reduction of 30% of all-cause mortality. And again, a very huge study. In this study was in Italy. The group of Giovanni De Gaetano was a 30% reduction in mortality also in the group who truly follow Mediterranean diet. And this is one of the last studies, was only in the States, was a 30% reduction. So Mediterranean diet works in protecting against cardiovascular disease. And another characteristic is the best adequacy for micronutrients. So this is also important. It's a very complete, from the nutritional point of view, diet. And when there is also room to study, because in some studies like this, you can see the small molecules, citrate, creatinine, homocysteine, alanine, also triglycerides, and also amino acids. So there is room on research how to improve the traditional Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean diet is the best, but we can even improve the healthier effects of Mediterranean diet, maybe complementing with some small molecules or changing the proportion of the different of these foods and so on. Mediterranean diet is criticized because it could be expensive, but not always is so expensive. If you choose local foods, seasonal foods, etc., you can be sure that you can reduce the price and also be so expensive. And also important is sustainability, and also there are several studies concluding that Mediterranean diet is sustainable for the planet, so we have to look for this. So when you look for what could be the best characteristic of diet, nutrition adequacy, effective of prevention, safe, easy to follow, etc., Mediterranean diet complying with all these items. So the conclusion is that Mediterranean diet should be regarded as the healthiest and most scientific supported dietary plan, promoting longevity, cardiovascular disease, and overall well-being. However, we think that we can improve the quality of and the effect of Mediterranean diet if you include other ingredients for our culture, like berries, cocoa, so foods, tea, and coffee. We share similar antioxidants and inflammatory properties. So we have the best diet, but we have to improve it in the next years. Thank you very much.